The conference room on the 14th floor of Donovan and Vance smelled like leather and old money. It was a Tuesday morning in early November, and Derek Vance sat at the far end of the glass table with the ease of a man who had already decided how the meeting would end. He smiled not at anyone in particular, just at the room, and said it quietly enough that it could be denied later. Claire runs this company like a machine because she has nothing to go home to. No husband, no children, no stakes. A few people looked at the table. A few did not look away fast enough. Claire Donovan stood at the head of the room, hands flat on her leather portfolio, and her face did not change, not 1 degree. That night, she stood alone at her office window on the 22nd floor, rain moving down the glass in long, slow streaks, the lights of Portland blurring into something almost warm below her. She had built an empire. And she had never felt more alone. The electrical fault happened on a Wednesday, just before 8 in the morning. The backup power relay on the 18th floor shorted out and knocked the lights and ventilation for the entire east wing. Susan Park, Claire's executive assistant, had it flagged and a vendor dispatched within 40 minutes, but the first crew was booked until noon, so she called the next name on the list a small, independent outfit, 2 electricians, and a truck, and asked for someone immediately. James Rourke pulled into the parking garage at 7:52. He was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that showed their work calluses at the base of each finger, a thin scar across the right knuckle from a panel door that had swung shut wrong 2 winters ago. He wore a gray flannel shirt and dark jeans, and carried a toolbox that had been his father's before it was his. The lobby receptionist handed him a visitor badge and pointed him toward the service elevator. He did not look particularly impressed by the 12-foot ceilings or the company name etched trin-brushed steel above the front desk or the large abstract canvas on the east wall that someone had paid serious money for. He looked like a man with a job to do who intended to do it without much ceremony. Claire was in the east hallway when the corridor went dark around her, phone to her ear, mid-sentence with a freight carrier in Tacoma about a rerouted shipment sitting in a Sacramento depot 3 days longer than it should have been. The emergency lighting strip gave just enough to see by a dim amber stripe along the baseboard. She heard footsteps coming from the utility access, steady and unhurried, and then a voice with the same quality as the footsteps. "Ma'am, I need you to press the override on the backup panel. It's behind the door to your left." She turned. A man she didn't recognize was already crouching near the junction box on the wall, with a small flashlight clamped between his teeth and his hands on the panel housing. "I'm on a call," she said. "I understand that," he said, without removing the flashlight. "I just need 30 seconds. She looked at him, assessed him, the way she assessed everything, in a fast second, then pressed the override. The lights came on. She went back to her call without another word. But as she passed her office on the way to the conference room, she glanced through the doorway and saw that he had paused near her desk, not touching anything, just standing, and he was looking at the only photograph she kept there, a small framed print, Claire at 7 or 8, sitting on the hood of an old pickup truck next to a man with the same dark eyes. Her father. James Rourke looked at it for just a moment. Then he went back to the panel without a word. Claire kept walking, but she had seen him look, and for a reason she didn't examine, she thought about it for the rest of the morning. He returned twice that week to finish the work, a relay replacement, a full inspection of the east wing conduit. Both times he arrived exactly when he said he would, cleaned up after himself, and left the work order on Susan's desk. On Friday afternoon, as he was loading the last of his equipment into the truck, Susan called his cell. She sounded slightly embarrassed. James listened, said it was fine, and told her he'd be there in 20 minutes. His daughter, Lily's school, had added an early dismissal to the calendar partway through the semester. He had no backup plan. His sister was in Bend, his closest neighbor worked days, and he had one job left to complete in the building. He asked Susan if there was any chance, just a lobby, just a couch, an hour at most, and Susan had gone to Claire, and Claire had said fine, just the lobby. Lily Rourke was 7 years old, small for her age, with her father's brown eyes and a quality of total fearlessness that either charmed people immediately or wore them out. She walked into the lobby of Donovan and Vance, dragging a pink backpack nearly as big as she was. Looked around with the careful attention of someone taking inventory, and climbed up onto the leather sectional near the reception desk. She sat cross-legged and studied the large backlit panel on the wall company leadership photos, titles listed in descending order of authority. At the top was a professional portrait of Claire Donovan, still, composed, looking directly into the camera with an expression that gave nothing away. Lily stared at it for a long time. Then she turned to the receptionist, a young man named Paul who was actively avoiding her gaze, and said with complete sincerity, "Is the lady upstairs sad?" She looked sad in the picture. Paul did not have a good answer for that. Claire came down at 12:15 to sign a delivery authorization for a shipment rerouted through Sacramento. She stepped out of the elevator with the folder already open, scanning the signature line, and she heard the voice before she saw where it came from. A small girl, on the lobby couch. Claire looked up. The girl looked back at her with the unguarded directness that belongs to young children and people who have stopped caring what anyone thinks. There was a pause, not long, but long enough that it became something else, the kind of stillness that happens when something catches in the chest before the mind catches up. Lily slid off the couch, walked over, and looked straight up. "Do you have any kids?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it. Susan materialized at her elbow with the folder and a pen. Claire signed, said she had a 2 o'clock, walked to the elevator, and stood with her back to the lobby until the doors opened. She did not answer the question. She did not answer it that afternoon either. Alone at her desk with the city below and the quiet hum of the building around her, she had answered every hard question placed in front of her for 9 years. She could not answer this one. The email arrived the following Monday evening, forwarded through 3 addresses before Susan flagged it and sent it to Claire without comment. It was an internal thread board members, 2 senior partners, Derek Vance's assistant discussing language for a proposed amendment to the governance charter. The amendment would require the CEO to demonstrated personal stability consistent with long-term institutional stewardship. The legal language was careful, but one board member, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had served since Claire's father's time, had replied to the thread without apparent concern that it might travel further. "She's brilliant. No one disputes that. But she'll never understand long-term legacy. She has no one to build it for." Claire read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and sat very still. She knew what the amendment was. It was not governance. It was a mechanism, a way to reframe her leadership as a liability by attaching it to what she didn't have, what she had never been able to have, as though that were a professional failing rather than a medical fact. She had known for 5 years. Since she was 27, since a surgery to remove a cyst had led to a conversation with a specialist in Northwest Portland, and the specialist had used words like significant scarring and severely compromised and "I'm sorry, Claire," and she had driven home alone and made dinner and gone to sleep, and told no one. She had locked the paperwork in the bottom drawer of her home desk and had not looked at it since. That night, she unlocked the drawer and set the folder on the kitchen table under the overhead light. The pages were slightly yellowed at the edges. The doctor's handwriting was careful and even, a kind of handwriting trained to deliver difficult news without drama. She read through it the way you read something you have memorized without meaning to the words already in your body before your eyes reach them, already in your bones, already settled into the particular weight they take on when you have carried them long enough. She sat there at the kitchen table in the quiet of her apartment for a long time. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed. James Rourke, texting to say he had found a conduit fitting he'd installed incorrectly and wanted to come back Thursday to fix it properly. He was sorry for the inconvenience. She stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed, "Thursday is fine." She put the folder back in the drawer. She did not lock it this time. He came back Thursday morning. The repair took 40 minutes. When he finished, he appeared briefly in her office doorway, not entering, just pausing to say everything was up to code. She nodded. He turned to go. Then, without fully understanding why, she said, "Thank you for being thorough." He looked back. "It's the job," he said. But he said it without deflection. The way people say things they mean exactly. The following week he was back on the building for a third-floor tenant, a small architecture firm with a panel throwing intermittent faults. The job required a rooftop inspection, which meant the utility stairs to the top and across the mechanical deck. When he pushed open the rooftop door at 7:40, Claire was already there. She came up most mornings. The roof had a maintenance platform facing southwest, and from it she could see the West Hills and the bridges over the Willamette and the city laid out in its early quiet before the weight of the day arrived. She brought coffee. She stood there for 15 minutes, alone. It was the only part of her day she didn't schedule. James said, "Sorry. I need the junction box." 5 minutes. She said it was fine. He crossed to the panel on the far side of the roof, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the city below began its slow gray waking. Then he said, not looking up from the panel, "How long have you been doing this?" She said, "About a year." He said his wife used to do something like it, sit on the back steps before anyone else was up, said it was the only part of the day that belonged to just her. Claire didn't respond to that. After a moment she asked how old his daughter was. He said 7. She asked if it was hard, doing it alone. He was quiet for a beat, then said it was different kinds of hard, at different times. He told her about teaching Lily to tie her shoes, 3 weeks of trying, every evening after dinner, until one morning Lily did it herself before breakfast and yelled for him from the hallway, and when he got there she was shaking with pride. He said his wife, Rachel, had been killed by a driver running a red light on Southeast Hawthorne 2 years ago in March. That for a long time afterward he hadn't known how to do any of it, not the shoelaces, not the pancakes, not the bedtime stories. He had figured it out because there was no one else. Claire listened without interrupting, which was not, for her, a natural state. She was trained to manage conversations, to steer them efficiently from one point to the next. She did not manage this one, she let it go where it went. Then she said, looking out at the hills, "I can't have children." She didn't look at him when she said it. She said it the way you say a fact you have carried long enough that it has become simply part of the landscape of your life. He did not say he was sorry. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, "That doesn't make you less of anything." She turned her face slightly away and looked at the edge of the West Hills, where the first light was beginning to show through the cloud cover. She didn't say anything else. He finished with the panel, latched the cover, picked up his bag, and walked back toward the door. She stayed until her coffee went cold. Then she went inside. The backpack incident happened on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later. Lily had left it in the lobby that afternoon, and James hadn't realized it was missing until they were home, and Lily went to take out her library book and found him in the kitchen with a look of catastrophe on her face. He texted Susan, who confirmed the bag was at the front desk and could be released by security any time. James drove back across town with Lily in the passenger seat, still in the dinosaur pajama top she'd changed into after the dentist. They arrived at 7:15. Claire was still in the building, lost in Q4 freight projections. She came down to retrieve something she'd lent Susan and walked out of the elevator directly into a small person in a dinosaur shirt clutching the recovered backpack to her chest like a rescued artifact. Lily looked up. "Oh, hi. You're the sad lady." James, standing 2 feet behind her, briefly closed his eyes. "I'm not sad," Claire said. It came out more automatic than intended. "You look less sad now," Lily said, studying her. "Maybe because you got some sleep." James said, "Lily, we're going." He looked at Claire. "I'm sorry." She says whatever's in her head. "Thank you for keeping the bag." "It's fine," Claire said. "She's not wrong." She looked at Lily. "Your dad makes you pancakes." Lily lit up entirely. "Banana ones. Have you ever had banana pancakes? He puts cinnamon in and sometimes blueberries, but the banana ones are the best. You should come." "Dad, can she come?" James said. "We're not inviting people over, Bug." "Why not? She seems nice. She's less sad now." There was a pause. Claire said, carefully, "Not tonight. But maybe sometime." She walked back to the elevator. In the truck on the way home, Lily was quiet for most of the drive, watching the lights of the Burnside Bridge pass overhead. Then she said, "Is she going to be our friend?" James kept his eyes on the road. He thought about the rooftop. About the way Claire had stood looking at the hills and said what she'd said without once looking for a response. "I don't know, Bug," he said. "I don't know." That night, Claire came home to her apartment in the Pearl District. 1,900 square feet of clean lines and careful choices. Every surface quiet. She stood in the middle of the living room with her coat still on. She had chosen this quiet deliberately, for years, as a form of armor. That night it felt different. Less like armor and more like an absence. She picked up her phone and called her mother. It was the first time in months. Margaret Donovan answered on the second ring, as she always did, as though she had been waiting but didn't want to admit it. They talked for a while about ordinary things. A leak in the guest bathroom, a neighbor's new dog. A book Margaret was reading. At the end, Margaret said, "I miss you, Claire." And Claire said, "I know, Mom. I'll come soon." She meant it when she said it. Margaret came 2 Saturdays later, with a canvas tote of old photographs she was digitizing before they deteriorated. She spread them across the coffee table and sorted through decades of Donovan family history, while Claire sat across from her with tea. There was Claire at 5, at 9, at 13. Robert Donovan at the warehouse, at a company holiday party, at Thanksgiving in the yard, and cousins' children, then their children, a spreading multiplication of family, the photographs documented with cheerful density. Margaret held one up. "Look how big Danny's kids have gotten. Can you believe it?" "No," Claire said. A pause. Then Margaret, in the careful tone she used when approaching something she'd been approaching for a long time. "Have you thought any more about adoption? You have the resources, and there are so many." "Mom." Claire's voice was level. "Stop." Margaret stopped. "I know you love me," Claire said. "I know that's why you ask. But every time you bring it up, I have to go back to that room, to sitting in a specialist's office at 27 and being told, in the nicest possible language, what I was never going to have. I have been living with that for 5 years, by myself, without telling you, without telling anyone, because I didn't want to perform it. I didn't want to become the woman everyone was careful around." She set down her mug. "I'm not angry at you, but I need you to understand what it costs me every time." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then her eyes filled, and she looked at her daughter with an expression that wasn't guilt, but something older and sadder, a parent understanding, too late and all at once, how much her child had been carrying without help. "Claire," she said, "I didn't know you'd been holding all of that alone." "I know," Claire said. "I know you didn't." They sat together for a while after that, not talking. That was its own kind of relief. The next morning, James came to submit the completed documentation for the third-floor job. He left it with Susan and waited near the elevator. Claire came out of her office with a stack of contracts, noticed him, said she'd take them. She signed at Susan's desk. When she finished, she looked up. James was gathering his folder. She said, "Your daughter, is she doing okay? In school?" He paused. Something in the way she asked it, the slight hesitation, the fact that she was asking at all, told him this was the first time she had started a conversation with him that had nothing to do with the building. "Yeah," he said. "She's doing great. Spelling test Monday. Got 100. Good," Claire said. "That's really good." She went back to her office. Susan watched the exchange from her desk, with the carefully blank expression of someone who had already drawn several conclusions. The school had organized a family day in mid-November, a half-Saturday event combining an art display, a literacy fair, and a potluck brunch in the gymnasium. For 2 weeks, Lily had been working on her family portrait, a project in which Miss Brennan asked each child to draw the people who made up their family. Lily had drawn her father in the center, tall, brown-haired, in an orange flannel shirt, and herself beside him in the purple dress she had recently decided was her favorite. At the edge, rendered with slightly less certainty, was a dog that did not exist but that Lily had been requesting for 2 years. Miss Brennan had paused beside Lily's desk during work time and asked gently whether there was anyone else she'd like to add. Lily thought about it with her marker cap in her mouth, which was not allowed but happened constantly. Then she took the red marker and wrote, in careful blocky letters, a name in the upper right corner of the page separate from the figures, as if still deciding where in the composition it belonged. The name was Claire. James saw the drawing during the gallery walk, framed under a strip of lights in the hallway outside Lily's classroom. He stood in front of it for a long moment, while other parents moved around him with coffee and cameras. He did not ask Lily about it. He just read the name in red in the corner, and moved on and took a picture of Lily grinning in front of her reading project, both front teeth gone. That evening he sent Claire a text. Lily's school has a student art show next Saturday morning. She worked really hard on some of it. Thought you might want to see it, if you're around. No pressure. Claire stared at the text. Then she typed back. What time? She arrived at 9:15, alone, in a navy coat. No makeup. Hair pulled back in a ponytail, a version of herself almost no one who worked for her had ever seen. The hallway of the elementary school was hung with crayon drawings and watercolors and marker portraits on construction paper, and it smelled like paste and floor wax and something sweet baking in the cafeteria at the far end of the building. James was near the entrance with Lily, who spotted Claire and immediately grabbed her hand and began pulling her down the hall at a pace that left no room for pleasantries, explaining the art show with the rapid authority of a very small docent who had been waiting for an audience. They made their way through the displays, and Claire let herself be led, asking questions about which pieces were Lily's, what inspired this one, why that particular shade of blue, what is this supposed to be, is that a horse or a dragon? And Lily answered every question with great seriousness and a patience she normally reserved for people she thought were worth the effort. James walked a few steps behind them. He had been watching Claire since she came through the door, the slight loosening that happened when she wasn't in a boardroom or a hallway with a briefcase in her hand, and he did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. Then they reached the family portrait hallway. Claire saw the drawing from several feet away. She walked toward it slowly and stopped in front of it and read it, the tall figure in the flannel shirt, the small girl beside him in the purple dress, the dog at the edge, rendered with the hopeful uncertainty of something deeply wished for, and the name, in red marker, up in the corner, written in a child's careful hand, separate from the rest of the figures, as if still deciding where in the picture it belonged. She did not cry. Her breathing stayed even, and her face stayed composed, but her right hand moved, almost involuntarily, and touched the edge of the paper, just the edge, just a fingertip, as though confirming it was real before coming back to her side. James stood a few feet behind her, quiet. Lily had already moved on to show something to a classmate's parent further down the hall. Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she turned, and James was there. They looked at each other without speaking. Lily called from down the hall, "Dad, come see Marcus's robot." They walked toward her, side by side. That night, at 9:47, Claire received an email from Derek Vance's assistant. The board vote was set. The second week of December, 12 days away. The amendment was attached the language about demonstrated personal stability, carefully constructed and perfectly aimed. Claire read it through once, closed her laptop, and sat in her dark living room for a long time. She spent the next 10 days preparing. Days with legal counsel and the company charter and the Q4 numbers, getting the facts cold enough that she could recite them without notes. Nights at her desk, trying to write the statement she would deliver to the board, not tactical, not a defense brief, not a performance, but something true, something that could not be walked back or reframed by anyone in that room. She wrote and deleted, rewrote and deleted again. She had drafts that read like press releases, and drafts that read like apologies, and drafts that read like board filings, and she hated all of them for different reasons. By the second Tuesday night, the document on her screen was 3 paragraphs long, and she had been sitting at her desk since 11, and it was now past 2, and she hated every sentence she had written. Her phone lit up on the desk beside her, a text from James Rourke. "You still up? I can see your light from across the block." She stared at the message. Then she typed, "Yes." He typed back, "You okay up there?" She set the phone down, picked it up again. Then she typed, "No." It was the first time she had said that to anyone who wasn't Susan. He came up 20 minutes later. He was still in his work clothes. He'd been running conduit in the building across the alley for a late-stage tenant build-out, and had seen her light from the exterior scaffolding at midnight, and again at 1:30. Again now. The night security officer knew him by sight, and let him up without a call. He came into her office and sat in the chair across the desk without making it a moment. No preamble. No, I was worried. No, what's going on? Just sat down, like it was a normal thing to do at 2 in the morning in someone's office. She turned the laptop toward him without explaining it. He read the 3 paragraphs slowly. He did not comment on the writing. He leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he said, "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone, but if you want to say something true, say what it cost you, not what you built." She looked at him across the desk. The city was quiet outside the glass. A few lights moved on the Burnside Bridge, far below. He looked back at her without urgency, without any apparent need for her to respond in a particular way, without the quality that most people had of waiting to be thanked for showing up. He just looked at her. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned the laptop back toward herself and began to delete what she had written and start again from the beginning. She worked until 4, slept 3 hours, came back. She was in the middle of a paragraph when Susan knocked and closed the door behind her and set a folder on the desk and said, "I need to show you something." It had taken Susan 12 days of careful work requests, made through the external auditing contact, cross-referenced against board expense logs and vendor payment records. The folder showed that Derek Vance had, over 4 months, directed just under $60,000 in discretionary company funds through a consulting vendor that did not exist, a shell company registered in Nevada, payments routed to an account connected to a private equity group, in which 3 of the voting board members held positions. The money had been used, in part, to produce the language of the proposed amendment. It was a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of the company's conflict of interest provisions. Claire read through the folder. "Set it on the corner of her desk. Don't file this anywhere," she said. "Don't mention it to anyone." Susan nodded and left. Claire looked at the folder for a moment, then went back to her statement. The morning of the board meeting was clear and cold. December light in Portland came in thin and silver, clean and brittle at the edges of things. Claire walked the 12 blocks from her apartment, with her statement folded in the interior pocket of her coat. She had printed it on paper, actually printed it, which she hadn't done for a personal document in years because she wanted to hold it in her hands. Something about holding it made it more real, and she needed it to be real. She needed it to feel like something she had chosen, not something that had been forced out of her. The board was assembled when she arrived. 11 people around the glass table, water pitchers placed at intervals, portfolios open, the ambient performance of institutional readiness. Derek Vance sat at the far end, in a well-cut charcoal suit, composed and unhurried, with the ease of a man who had already decided how the meeting would end and was simply waiting for the formality of it to catch up. He watched Claire come in and take her place at the head of the table with an expression that was almost paternal, patient, certain, prepared for the inevitable. He had made the same face at her in this room 17 times in 4 years. She had counted. Susan's folder sat in Claire's briefcase on the floor beside her chair. She did not open the briefcase. She pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket instead, smoothed it once on the table surface, and looked around the room at the 11 faces. Then she began. She did not talk about revenue. She did not talk about freight networks, or the 214 full-time employees, or the 3 new regional contracts signed in the 4th quarter, or any of the numbers she could have recited cold. She talked about her father. She talked about the Pearl District warehouse on a rainy October morning when she was 9 years old, sitting on a stool at his desk, while he explained to her that a company wasn't something you built, it was something you chose, every day, to keep building. She talked about the years after he got sick, when she restructured the company's debt in the same semester she finished her last year of school, because there was no one else to do it. She talked about the morning after the funeral when she sat in his chair for the first time and understood that the company was hers now, which meant the 312 people who depended on it were hers too, not like ownership, like obligation, The permanent, choosing kind. Then she paused. She looked at the table. When she looked up, she looked directly at Derek Vance. I was told that I have no one to build this for. That a woman without children cannot understand legacy. She let that settle in the room for a moment. I understand legacy because I have watched what happens when it fails. I understand it because every decision made in this building has been made for people who count on this company for their mortgage payments, their health insurance, their children's school supplies. I understand it because my father built something with his whole life and handed it to me. And I will not let it become a vehicle for someone else's interests at the expense of the people who make it run. She set the paper down flat on the table. Legacy isn't who you leave behind. It's what you leave standing. Silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable waited. Derek Vance said, "That's a beautiful speech, Claire, but it doesn't address the governance question that the proposed amendment is designed to." She reached down and opened the briefcase. She lifted out Susan's folder and placed it in the center of the table without ceremony. "Outside counsel has reviewed the contents," she said. "I'd ask the board to take a recess." 3 people reached for the folder at once. The recess lasted 47 minutes. Claire sat alone in the small conference room, adjacent to the boardroom, with a paper cup of bad coffee from the credenza machine and her statement still folded on the table in front of her. Her phone lay face up. New texts. She had not told James when the meeting was scheduled. She hadn't wanted it to become something he felt obligated to manage around. When the board reconvened, the chair, Patricia Howell, 6 years on the board, reliably independent in her reading of the charter, announced that in light of the documentation provided, the proposed amendment was being tabled indefinitely, pending a full external audit. Derek Vance was asked to recuse himself from all board proceedings during the investigation and to step back from his operational role effective immediately. He gathered his portfolio and his phone and left without a word. The door closed behind him with a sound that was quieter than it should have been for what it meant. Patricia Howell looked at Claire. "I think that's all for this morning," she said. Claire walked out of the building into the December air. She stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance and breathed. James was across the street. He was standing at the edge of the parking lane in his work jacket, hands in his pockets, Lily asleep against his shoulder, with her cheek pressed against his neck. He didn't know how the meeting had gone. His expression said exactly that, not expectant, just present. He had come because Lily had decided that waiting was something you did with someone, and they had been standing there for a while. Claire looked at him across the 4 lanes. He looked back. She walked across when the light changed and stopped in front of him and said, "It's done." He shifted Lily on his shoulder. Yeah, she said. He nodded once, slow. "Good," he said. Just that. Lily stirred and opened her eyes and looked at Claire with the soft confusion of a child waking outdoors in December. Then her face cleared into a smile. "Hi," she said, still mostly asleep. "Hi," Claire said. 3 months passed. Derek Vance resigned from the board in January following the conclusion of the audit. The governance amendment was formally withdrawn. Donovan and Vance closed the 4th quarter 7% above projection. Claire promoted Susan to Director of Executive Operations and brought on 2 new regional managers in the spring. The company kept running, the way it always had, because she kept choosing to build it. On a Sunday in February, Portland had one of those rare winter mornings when the clouds broke and the light came through wide and pale gold, the kind of light that makes the city look briefly like itself at its best. James Rourke's kitchen was warm. Lily stood on a step stool at the counter wearing an apron 3 sizes too large, stirring a bowl of batter with the total concentration of someone performing surgery. James stood at the stove with butter beginning to brown in the pan. Claire sat at the kitchen island with both hands around a mug of coffee, watching them. She had brought her own beans. James's coffee was not good enough, in her opinion, and she had said so, and he had laughed and told her she was welcome to take over if she felt that strongly about it. So she had made the coffee. It was good. She was drinking it in his kitchen on a Sunday morning and it felt entirely natural, which was the part that surprised her least. Lily finished stirring and regarded the bowl with satisfaction. "They're ready," she announced. James ladled the first ones in. They spread in the butter with that low, soft sizzle that belongs to kitchens and mornings and people who have decided to stay a while. He slid the finished stack in front of Claire, 3 pancakes, golden at the edges, banana sliced across the top, a dusting of cinnamon she could smell before she even picked up the fork. Lily leaned on the counter on her elbows and watched with the focused anticipation of someone who had been waiting for this verdict a long time. "Do you like banana ones?" she asked. Claire took a bite. The banana was warm and sweet, and the cinnamon was exactly right. "They're perfect," she said. Lily pumped her fist and very nearly fell off the stool, and James caught her by the back of the oversized apron without looking up from the pan. He glanced at Claire over the top of Lily's head. She was already looking at him. Nothing needed to be said. Just that moment, held between them across the ordinary clutter of a Sunday morning, the batter bowl on the counter, the coffee going warm in the mug, the February light falling through the window above the sink and settling over all of it gently, like something that had finally come to rest. Claire Donovan had built an empire. She had built it with precision and patience, and a will that did not look for permission. She had stood at 22 floors of glass and watched a city that felt like everyone else's, and she had carried every hard thing alone because that was what she knew how to do. She had believed, without quite knowing she believed it, that belonging was something that happened to other people. She had been wrong. She had built an empire. And she had finally found somewhere to come home to,